Okay, why don't we resume? We're now going to turn to the project that was advised by Professor Hill. And we have Sarah Braverman, who's going to speak about a federal policy to manage refrigerant banks. So take it away.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Braverman. This past semester, my team has been working with the Natural Resources Defense Council to develop recommendations for the better management of hydrofluorocarbon refrigerant banks. I'll begin this presentation with a brief background on hydrofluorocarbons, which are commonly known as HFCs. I will lead into an overview of our project where I will introduce our client. I will then go over the scope of our research and the findings from our case studies. Towards the end of this presentation, I will discuss the policy recommendations we believe are necessary to reduce HFC emissions. Hydrofluorocarbons, known as HFCs, are a class of man-made fluorinated gases. They are primarily used in refrigeration and air conditioning, but they're also used in fire suppressants and aerosols. HFCs were first used as an alternative refrigerant to the ozone-depleting chlorofluorocarbons, commonly known as CFCs. The successful implementation of the Montreal Protocol in 1988 led to the phasing out of CFCs around the world. While HFCs do not deplete the ozone, they are still a very potent greenhouse gas. While their potency is measured by their global warming potential, which is commonly referred to as GWP, this is basically a calculation of how powerful a greenhouse gas is compared to carbon dioxide. To give you an idea of how potent HFCs are, if CO2 has a GWP of 1, HFCs can have a GWP of up to 15,000. Not only that, but HFCs can exist in the atmosphere for up to 260 years. HFCs are released into the atmosphere during their use, maintenance, and transport. This leakage happens largely unintentionally. It's usually due to leaky equipment or just the lack of proper management. The average grocery store leaks 25% of its HFCs each year. Air conditioners and refrigeration systems are responsible for 86% of all HFC emissions in the United States. Almost a third of that comes from commercial refrigeration, which refers to air conditioners, refrigerators, and freezers used in businesses of all sizes. Without proper management of HFC emissions will increase global warming by 0.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. If we are to meet the Paris Climate Agreement's goal of limiting warming by less than 2 degrees Celsius, reducing HFC emissions will be essential. In December of 2020, Congress passed with bipartisan support the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, commonly known as the AIM Act. The passing of this bill was one of the most significant political actions the US has taken to combat climate change, as it calls for the phase down of HFC production and use by 85% over the next 15 years. So what would this look like? A reduction on this scale would equate to reducing the emissions of nearly 195 million cars every single year. Our client, the Natural Resources Defense Council, is one of the leading environmental nonprofits in the United States. They have been advocating for the proper HFC management and the phase out of these chemicals for over 30 years. The NRDC asked our team to develop a set of policy recommendations for the management of the HFC refrigerant bank, which refers to the quantity of HFCs currently in use. Over the past 3 months, our team has researched current end-of-life management practices of HFCs. This includes their recycling, reclamation, and destruction. We looked at the management programs and policies in the EU, Japan, and Australia, as these regions have some of the strongest HFC management practices in the world. Within the US, we also looked at similar programs in California and Washington State. In addition to a literature review of HFC management programs, we also conducted interviews with regulatory and market experts in the HFC industry. We would like to note a couple of challenges we encountered while conducting our research. In some of the regions that we looked at, The data on HFC phase down programs was not made publicly available by the regulatory agencies of that region. In other cases, the phase down programs were still too new to even offer significant data for our project. We approached our analysis conservatively with these limitations in mind. Our analysis of these studies helped us identify 4 effective mechanisms that have been implemented in the US, the EU, Japan, and Australia. The first mechanism is supply chain accountability. Refrigerant chemical producers hold a significant amount of power over the supply chain. Cradle to grave responsibility will incentivize producers to make better HFC management decisions. The second mechanism is leakage monitoring and reporting. Japan and the EU have relatively comprehensive registration, record keeping, and reporting. And as a result, they have some of the most stringent regulations on refrigerant leakage. These regulations led to an increase in HFC reclamation following the implementation of these measures. The third widely used mechanism is to set bans or restrictions on the production or import of certain HFCs with high global warming potentials. This approach was widely effective in many of the countries that we surveyed. The last mechanism is to provide proper certification for people working within the industry. Effective HFC management policies set requirements for operators at every level of the value chain, which included mandating certifications set and administered by the government. Our research unearthed quite a few different policy mechanisms for managing HFCs. I will review a handful of these mechanisms and the role they play in reducing HFCs emissions throughout the life cycle of these chemicals. We believe these management practices merit consideration from the EPA and other regulators because of their feasibility and efficacy in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. To begin with, we recommend that the EPA establish extended producer responsibility, meaning that HFC producers are ultimately responsible for ensuring that the HFCs they produce are properly destroyed or reclaimed at the end of their life. Extended producer responsibility relies on being able to track the products of these producers. Therefore, the EPA should also implement a comprehensive tracking system for all HFCs used within the United States. This brings us to the second step in the HFC life cycle, the equipment manufacturers. We recommend that the EPA require HFC equipment manufacturers to use reclaimed or recycled chemicals in all new equipment. This requirement should also be extended to equipment operators and servicers, requiring them to only use reclaimed or recycled chemicals when restocking refrigerant systems. We also recommend that the EPA sponsor educational messaging and training programs for equipment operators and servicers, and expand on the existing certification requirements that are already in place. We've designed this circular management approach based on successful HFC management practices from around the world. By enforcing these management practices at each stage of the HFC life cycle, the EPA can maximize their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One of the most significant things we can do to mitigate climate change is to reduce the emission of HFCs into the atmosphere. They contribute to climate change on a much greater scale than carbon dioxide. HFC emissions are largely preventable, which is why their management is so important. We would like to thank Christina Teodoridi and Alex Hilbrand of the NRDC for giving us and SEPA the opportunity to research and design policy recommendations for addressing the existential threat of climate change. And by us, I mean the outstanding members of our team, Allison Day, Carol Hugh, Rachel Grace Patton, Andrew Solfest, Rachel Goodgall, Tim Woodruff, Alina Yurova, and my co-manager, Charlie Sad. Finally, I would like to thank Professor Adrienne Hill for her exceptional advice and guidance throughout this project. Thank you for listening. I will now take time for questions.
Good, very nice. Good job, Sarah. Questions, comments? Okay, Jenny.
Great job, Sarah. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the implications or how you think the Biden-Harris administration will actually start to implement, regulating HFCs and like the timeline and how much cooperation. It sounds like there will be a lot of cooperation with the industries. But yeah, like what are the next steps for actually implementing this?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Jenny. Well, the recent passing of the AIM Act was really a big push for managing HFCs on a national level. So we can see that, and that has a 15-year timeline for reducing HFCs. So we expect that, and the reason for that large timeline is to prevent any kind of price shocks as we start to phase out the use of HFCs and start to use alternatives on a much greater scale. Alternatives such as ammonia or carbon dioxide, actually. And there have been a lot of, like we mentioned earlier, there are some excellent state policies in California and in Washington state that have been pretty successful at reducing the demand for HFCs, and particularly those of high global warming potentials. And yeah, we expect to see a lot of collaboration. We spoke with people all across the industry, both on the policy side and on the manufacturing side, and everyone is in quite supportive ending the use of these very, very potent greenhouse gases.
Okay, other questions? Do you see any, Stephanie? Nope.
I don't see any more questions.
Okay, Sarah, thank you, and thank you to the group. Very nice job.